welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, this is David Bernstein, and welcome back to The Contrarian podcast, where we talk about challenging topics with very smart people. And I'm very delighted to have on, in addition to my co-host, Cliff Smith today, who is the Director of Government Affairs at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, to have Ilya Somin, who's on with us today. Ilya is somebody that I've followed on Twitter. I've seen, read his writing. He's one of these figures who I think is intellectually honest at all times. I've noticed a tremendous intellectual consistency. So you tend to call out both the right and the left. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Ilya, about your background, and the things that you've been writing about. Why don't we start there?
Sure. So my name is Ilya Somin. I'm a law professor at George Mason University. I'm also the Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. I write about a lot of things, but most relevant to today's discussion, I've written extensively about political knowledge and ignorance, about which subject I've written a book called Democracy and Political Ignorance. And while it would be a mistake to say that ignorance or bias or bad information processing is the only cause of anti-Semitism, whether on the left or on the right, as we will, I think, discuss today, I will note some ways in which it's nonetheless an important contributing factor to both left and right-wing varieties of anti-Semitism, and perhaps also to some types of anti-Semitism, which cannot as easily be categorized in ideological or political terms.
Fantastic. I think that's a great place to start. I'm kind of curious to get your sense today. We have aggressive left-wing politics and we have aggressive right-wing politics. I think they've always been part of our political discussion, but they're perhaps more robust. The wings are perhaps more robust than they've been in the past. How would you characterize American politics today in terms of, and maybe compared to where it was 20 or 30 years ago? Do you see do you agree with my basic characterization that the right is more extreme and the left is more extreme today?
So I would certainly say that they are more polarized than they were 20 years ago. And indeed, during most other periods of American history, we're at a period of some of the greatest political polarization in American history. In addition, the political right has undergone a fundamental transformation from being, relatively speaking, a free market conservative political movement to being a sort of right-wing populist nationalist political movement, similar to those that traditionally existed more often in Europe. There have been some changes on the left as well, but I think they've not been quite as drastic as those on the right. Obviously, much more can be said, but that's my sort of in a nutshell characterization of where we are politically now compared to 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. So when I was growing up and as a nice Jewish center left liberal I would never have the left that I knew primarily was sort of didn't have a theory, didn't have an ideology. It was sort of like there were haves and there were have-nots. There was no theory as to why there were haves and have-nots, only that it was the responsibility of the haves to help out the have-nots. And while there were ideologues out there, and I knew that they were there, and I encountered them on campus and among a certain percentage of the professoriate, it wasn't the dominant discourse on the left. It seems to me that there have been some huge shifts in that way, that part of the left, which did have a grand theory for why there were haves and have-nots, has now become dominant in a way that it wasn't, 20 or 30 years ago. Do you agree with that, or am I?
I would say only partially. I would say first, even 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were certainly lots of left-wingers, particularly in the intellectual world, who did have grand theories about inequality and its causes and what should be done about it and the like. Sure. Left-wing politicians, both then and today, didn't necessarily go into the details of their speech of these things in their stump speeches, but they were certainly out there. Secondly, I'm not convinced that sort of radical left identity politics is dominant on the left generally. Rather, I think it's particularly significant in the intellectual world and on university campuses. But that's not the same thing as it's dominating, say, the Democratic Party overall in the way that, say, Trumpian nationalism has come to dominate the Republican Party. You can see this in the very different attitudes toward the Israel-Hamas conflict that you see from most congressional Democrats or the Biden administration on the one hand, where they're at least to a significant extent supportive of Israel, even if not on every point, versus what you see with sort of campus radicals and the like. And this plays out obviously not just with Israel, but with some other issues as well. So I think on the left, there is a division between sort of far left radicals and somewhat more moderate types. That division has been there before, but the radicals in some ways are more vocal in this era, and also with social media and modern telecommunications, sort of the normie public, if you want to call them that, sees the left-wing radicals a bit more than they did, say, 30 or 40 years ago, where if you didn't follow events on campus closely or didn't read certain kinds of far left media, then it might have been easier to sort of be oblivious to to this movement.
Mm. So, do you think that the mainstream left, the party itself, is actually now pushing back? Do you think we've passed the, people say, have we passed peak woke? Have we passed peak woke?
I don't know for sure. I think the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, which has some of its own problems, but the Democratic Party faces a common problem for large big tent political parties. It serves as a radical wing, which is an important part of its base, but also may alienate moderate voters or other groups that they want to attract. But it's difficult for them to just completely throw the radical wing overboard. So what they do is engage in coalition politics, and sometimes that coalition politics is effective and sometimes it isn't. And again, in the modern media environment, it's a little bit harder to sort of sweep your embarrassing radicals under the rug than it might have been several decades ago. And also political party structures in general, for various reasons that you could do a whole other podcast on, but those political party structures are somewhat weaker than they were a couple of generations ago. Obviously, the rise of Donald Trump is a strong example of that, even though obviously the party establishment didn't want him for the most part, but he rose anyway. In the Democratic Party, the establishment has been somewhat more resilient, but still, there's only so much that it can do to, control its more fringe elements. I think there is a debate. I'm not a Democrat myself, nor am I a Republican, but I think there's a debate among Democrats about, whether certain woke excesses should be curbed in order to make the party more electorally appealing. If they should be curbed, though, it's not entirely clear, what form that would take. They can't simply, short of some kind of authoritarian movement, they can't simply tell these radicals to stop saying the stuff that you're saying. What they might be able to do is do what Bill Clinton did 30 years ago, which is sort of
Sister
more
Soldier.
mainstream Democrats could more openly denounce some of the radicals. And a few of them have begun to do that on some issues, but I think they do face a difficulty that they don't want to too greatly alienate a part of their base. So I'm not a political strategist. I'm not sure exactly how the Democratic Party can handle this, but there definitely is some internal conflict and debate within the party and among the political left more generally about these issues.
Yeah. So you're a professor at George Mason Law. Do you live in Virginia?
Yes.
So Virginia had these gubernatorial elections a couple years ago, and Glenn Youngkin wins in a state that Joe Biden just handily won not long before, and there was this debate raging, particularly in places like Loudoun County, Virginia, over critical race theory in schools, and it looks like that played a pretty decisive role in pushing Youngkin over the edge and over Terry McAuliffe. And I remember when that was happening after those elections, there was this sort of momentary fierce debate about whether this was going to be a Sister Souljah moment for the Democratic Party. James Carville, the longtime political strategist who worked under Clinton, probably orchestrated the Sister Souljah moment, said that the Democratic Party at that time needed to go through woke detox. And obviously that really didn't happen. In fact, I remember speaking with some Democratic Party activists not long after the election and saying, "Oh, well, aren't you going to now start to ask yourself of whether the politics of denying or even opposing, any of your opposition to critical race theory might have backfired for you?" And the answer was clearly no. They were very much in denial, and they thought that it was a complete, it was a complete Republican rhetorical attack, and it had no merit at all. And I thought, okay, unless somebody else prevails here, they're not going to learn from that moment. Do you agree with that? That like that sort of moment after the gubernatorial uh, debate, that was sort of when this was set in stone, and now we're back where we were 2 years ago.
Not entirely. First, well, it's been a while since I've looked at the data from the 2021 Virginia election, which was very close. Youngkin won by 51 to 49.
Right.
I'm not convinced CRT was the big issue. To my mind, a bigger issue that affected far more people was school closures. And, indeed, one of the first things Youngkin did was get the state legislature to pass bipartisan legislation requiring schools to reopen. And there were a number of other issues in the election as well. Granted, in a 51-49 election, almost any issue can potentially be a tipping point. But I think
Sure.
the CRT thing was more something that engaged committed activist types rather than the general public as a whole, particularly swing voters, most of whom don't pay much attention to the details of public policy or to various incidents and the like, but who certainly did know that schools were closed because many of their kids were and my kids too were among the people who could not go to school. That said, it is certainly true that certain woke excesses are unpopular, but with swing voters, a majority of the public. Democrats for the last 2 or 3 years, have been trying to figure out how to deal with that while at the same time not alienating their activist base too much. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not clear so far whether they've come up with a good solution to that problem. Though I would note, obviously, that the Republican Party also has its own weaknesses and its own
Yeah.
problems, which they also have not dealt with very well. They did, of course, win the 24 election, but they won it with a big structural advantage given inflation, and they won it by a much narrower margin than other anti-incumbent parties in other parts of the world have had in recent
Mhm.
elections dealing with the same price increases. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, a common problem of when you have a two-party system. Each party is a fairly big coalition, and therefore each will have some problems, dealing with sort of active some things that its activist base wants, but that swing voters might not want. And obviously, in the case of Republicans, they also have to deal with the egregiousness of Trump.
Yeah. Let's talk about the right a little bit now. And
Sure.
so I mean, I think I could argue that on the left, while the Democratic Party hasn't been captured by to the same degree as the Republican Party, institutions on the left have been more captured, just not the political party. But on the right, institution is not. You could argue, and I think you are arguing that in the right, really, the populist wing has taken over the Republican Party. To what degree? I mean, you're right now seeing this sort of play out in a very interesting way. Even in the administration, there are different wings within. Maybe you could argue the different wings within the populist movement. But you have who was going to own foreign policy, for example, was a real question for a few days early in the Trump administration. You had was it going to be an isolationist? And there was a lot of pressure, I think, on Trump to bring in people like that on the foreign policy structure, or was it going to be sort of, you could call it a neocon? I don't think it's the right term, but a sort of national security hawk. And it looks like the national security hawks won out. Does that sort of in any way contradict the thesis that there's been a populist takeover, or maybe there's just been a
So I would
reordering?
say two things. One is it's not clear to me the Hawks, if you want to call it that, have in fact won out, given people like Tulsi Gabbard, who's a Putin sympathizer and is the nominee for Director of National Intelligence. Secondly, I'm not sure that it's a hawk versus dove kind of issue entirely. Rather, it's in a sort of a nationalist populist movement, which is not necessarily dovish, witnessed their desire, many of them, to attack Mexico over drug cartels, versus one that upholds liberal democratic values internationally and promotes institutions like NATO and the like. And sadly, while there are a few people in administration who are not entirely alienated from liberal internationalism, I think it's pretty clear that it's going to move significantly in the direction of sort of populist nationalism, which sometimes will be hawkish, as with Mexico and perhaps also with Israel, but is largely indifferent in many ways to America's traditional alliance network and also to liberal democratic values, the kind that the U.S. has tried, not always successfully, not always consistently, but nonetheless has tried to a large degree at least to uphold since World War II. And this is why I'm concerned about the sort of foreign policy aspect of the new Republican coalition. It's not that I think they'll be dovish isolationists and just do nothing. It's that they're indifferent and in some cases actively hostile to liberal democratic values, to our alliance network, and many of them have sympathies with various brutal dictators like Vladimir Putin and others.
Yeah, and I'm going to have Cliff come in 1 second, but I have sort of one more question along these lines. I mean, people who are concerned about Trump may be concerned to different degrees about what's about to happen. There's sort of the most extreme concerns that I mean, I've heard people. I mean, some of them, some of it are like this is Hitler and the Holocaust, and then there's people who think that Trump is going to do everything in their most frightening imagination they could think of, from canceling their kids' independent education plan. I've heard that to banning birth control and the rest. And then there are people who have concerns that he's going to corrupt the Justice Department or the FBI. What is your and it seems to me that those projections matter. I mean, they're not just if you're worried about this, you have to decide where you're going to draw the lines, what you're going to prioritize, and what you're going to sort of let slide by, or else you'll be like Chicken Little all the time and say everything's bad and no one was going to pay attention to you. How do you calibrate that in yourself and in terms of expressing your concerns and where maybe not to go?
I mean, for myself, I would try to focus on issues where I have some expertise. As to the broader question of, how bad is it going to be? I hope and I expect that sort of the worst possible predictions won't be realized. Nonetheless, we have a president who tried to stay in power through force and fraud when he lost an election last time. That shows his fundamental contempt for basic liberal democratic values. He and his minions, including some he has nominated to key posts, have expressed their desire to use the levers of government to persecute their political opponents and the like. I hope that institutional constraints will make it difficult for them to do that, or at least won't enable them to fully realize this. Nonetheless, that problem is real. In addition, they have a long list of pretty horrible policies in the areas of immigration and trade and undermining America's alliances. Now, again, not all of this will necessarily be realized. There may be institutional constraints. There may be other constraints. So I don't think, this is Hitler or whatever. On the other hand, analogies to people like Viktor Orban in Hungary are more to the point. My hope is that the American political system has more checks and balances and a stronger civil society than Hungary did, so that he won't in fact be able to rule like Orban. Nonetheless, I think this is an extremely concerning moment in American politics, and frankly, we talked about various woke hexes existed before. There are problems with excessive wokeness, but I think they're actually pretty minor compared to the danger that this movement poses.
Ilya, I wanted to ask you about sort of a little bit more of a historical lens. You wrote an article about a year ago in Reason magazine concerning sort of the left and sympathy for Hamas. And you said
Yeah.
it wasn't an aberration, and you pointed to different historical trends concerning socialism and other forms of radicalism on the left. And repeatedly, just in the past few minutes, we've talked about things along the lines of populist nationalism sort of making a comeback, something that was certainly big. It seems to me in different parts of the right and left in the pre-World War II era. Do you have anything to say in terms of how would you look at these dueling trends on different sides of the political aisle from a historical perspective?
So obviously, populist or authoritarian nationalism, long history dating back at least to the 19th century, and it had various awful 20th century manifestations with Nazism, but also in places like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and elsewhere. With the left wing support for Hamas, and in the piece that I wrote, it's really just a blog post, I noted that after the October 7th attack, sort of those horrible terrorist attacks, there were various far leftists in the West who expressed sympathy for Hamas. I want to emphasize there's a difference here between the far left and the more moderate or mainstream left, the vast majority of whom did not express such sympathies, but there definitely existed on the far left in the US and Europe. And I noted there that while there are some interesting peculiarities for why it happened in this instance, it is part of a history of the far left being willing to countenance things like atrocities, oppression, mass murder to gain their ends. These people defended Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro, all of whom were horrible mass murderers who killed hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And the core issue here is that if you want a radical transformation of society in direction of socialism, by which I mean government control of all or nearly all of the economy and many other aspects of society, that turns out it can't be done without massive oppression, mass murder, and so forth. So if you want to advocate that, either you have to sort of pretend that it's not happening, right, to sort of close your eyes to the fact that that this is what would be necessary, or you have to embrace it. And there certainly have been some far leftists pretending it didn't happen, and who will say, "Oh, Mao didn't really kill very many people, or Stalin didn't." But there are others who have said, "Yeah, if it's for the right purpose, then it's justified. And if you're willing to justify the Lenin, Stalins, and so forth, then the smaller scale atrocities that Hamas did could also be justified." Though there is the intricacy, obviously Hamas is not a socialist or left-wing or egalitarian movement. It's a radical Islamist movement. So you might ask, well, why would far leftists be sympathetic to them? And and different far leftists might have different reasons. But if you are a far leftist, it's likely that you believe that sort of the greatest evil in the world is is capitalism, and which is led by the West, and so you will have some sympathy for anti-Western or anti-capitalist movements, even if those movements themselves are not actually necessarily socialist or left-wing or egalitarian, which Hamas obviously is not really any of those three things, and so. There is a sense of like that they sympathize with groups like Hamas and some other anti-Western non-left-wing regimes before, like that of Iran, because they feel like these people are fighting the same enemy. There is also an issue that we can talk about of sort of the understanding of the Jews in certain types of socialist and far left thought. There is a distinctive kind of far left anti-Semitism, which is different from right-wing anti-Semitism that we can talk about if you're interested.
Sure. I would just ask one follow-up question to the bigger picture, though. You have said that you think a lot of these ideologies that we're discussing, at least on the left, are sort of coming from sort of the high-minded academy sort of crowd. Do you? But it has not captured the party, the wider left-wing movement. Do you see that as being generational, or is that more just a failure of the ideology to really penetrate outside of the academy, or some mix of the two?
I don't think it's solely limited to the academy. I think it's limited to certain kinds of intellectual and activist um, uh, circles, some of which are in the academy, but others, might be in other places. Why hasn't it spread more widely? That's sort of an interesting question that I'm not sure I have the answer. Because of course, there are periods when far left socialism was more popular, and if you look in France, it's growing somewhat in terms of it, the overall left. So so I'm not sure exactly why this is something I have to acknowledge some limits to my own expertise. One possibility is that sort of the traditional far left appeal of class conflict is harder to popularize in an era when people don't primarily think of themselves as like working class versus bourgeoisie or whatever, but focus on other identities. There might be other reasons as well, which is not to say that that it can't potentially grow more broadly. Like before 2016, I wouldn't have expected something like Trumpism to take over the American right. So even though I don't now expect far left socialism to take over the left in the US or even in most European countries. I could be wrong about that. Sadly, over the last decade in general, in American and European politics, things have gone worse than I would have expected before it. So, I could once again be proven, overly optimistic, though I'm.
Since you brought that up, I'll ask you this too. You've mentioned the sort of the populist takeover of the Republican Party under Trump. Do you see that as an ideological transformation, or do you see that? Do you think? I guess a better way of asking this is: do you think it will outlive Donald Trump's second term?
I don't know. I think in part it depends on how that term goes and how it is perceived by people. And in part also, it depends on, uh, who emerges to lead the Republican Party after Trump. Uh, so, and you can imagine situations where sort of some elements of Trumpism, if you want to call it that, are retained and other ones are not. So I think we're at a moment where sort of American politics is in flux, and therefore it's hard, at least for me, to predict exactly where the Republican Party will be 5 or 10 years from now, or even the Democratic Party either.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism in the current political and ideological environment. Um, you know, I mean, there are people who don't think that anti-Semitism is on the rise. I think that there's a pretty good case that it is in certain ways in certain sectors. Um, what might be driving that? What in the political and ideological environment is driving that? Whether it's the traditional right wing variety or the more the more novel left wing variety.
So what I would say is when I look at data on this, and the data is imperfect and there's different surveys, I'm not sure we see a higher percentage than before of people being anti-Semitic. That is, like, if you look at the percentage of people who hold various anti-Semitic stereotypes and views in surveys now compared to 5 or 10 years ago, it looks like it's not that many more. But for people who do have those views are more salient. Salient is sort of a political science term for sort of how much of a focus there isn't a particular issue. Is most people don't pay a lot of attention to politics, and therefore they may have views on a lot of issues they don't give much thought to or pay much attention to. And anti-Semitism, for those who have various anti-Semitic views, may be more salient now than it was 10 years ago. Why is that so? I think it's so for a couple reasons. Obviously, on the right, there's a long historical connection between nationalism and anti-Semitism, and to the extent that certain kinds of nationalistic and xenophobic views are more salient on the right than they were 10 or 20 years ago, you would see more right-wing anti-Semitism, not in the sense that more right-wingers are anti-Semitic than they used to be, but that those who are or who have some anti-Semitic prejudices, they're more likely to be visible. On the left, obviously the Gaza war has highlighted this, but also uh, um, uh, the greater visibility of sort of the campus and intellectual far left, which, as I mentioned before, has its own distinctive type of anti-Semitism, and also. This is not actually new, but it has gradually crept up over a period of maybe 30, 40 years, with sort of Israel and Palestine emerging as an important cause for the international left. You can, in principle, be supportive of, say, a Palestinian state or whatever and not be anti-Semitic. And there are certainly people who hold those views. You can also believe, as I do in some cases, that Israel has committed some injustices and not be anti-Semitic. But to the extent that you're highly focused on it, and you may also have some pre-existing anti-Semitic tendencies or prejudices, that obviously contributes to the greater saliency of anti-Semitism on the far left, and in some cases even beyond it. So, in one sense, you could say it should be comforting for Jews that it's not so much that more people are anti-Semitic, but that it's just that those who are, it's more salient. But of course, it becoming more salient is still painful and scary, for Jews. And even if these views, I think, are held only by a minority, maybe even a relatively small minority, 10, 15% of the population or whatnot, nonetheless, some of those people are violent and scary. And otherwise painful to deal with. So an increase in saliency can still be bad, even if it doesn't lead to very much of an increase in sort of the overall percentage of people who are anti-Semitic.
Let me ask you one other question on a related matter. When you're talking about all the campus protests and such again, how do you view the issue of sort of foreign money, particularly from some Gulf countries that have gone into universities? Do you think that is a significant vector to increasing this or not? Do you have any views on that at all?
I don't know much about the foreign money issue. My intuition, which could be wrong, is that I'm skeptical that this is a major factor. I think it's pretty obvious that what has happened is, it's far leftists on campus and sometimes people from off campus who are doing it. They had these views before and would have them even if, independently of whether Qatar or some other country is giving the university some money. I think there could be issues if there are sort of certain strings attached to money. Maybe universities should refuse them. That's something you would want to talk about with people who know more about the issue than I do. But I'm skeptical, that these campus protesters, some of them are genuinely doing bad things that have been and should be cracked down on. But I'm skeptical that they're doing them because like Qatar is secretly paying them or whatnot, or even that they believe the things that they believe solely because Qatar, Iran, or some other foreign power, has been telling them those things. I think, this is for the most part an organic element of certain kinds of far left ideologies that has been there and would be there, even if these foreign entities were not involved at all.
I think I could come up with a more expansive rationale than you just did about how Qatari money might affect discourse. But that said, I think if you go too far down that lane, you end up obscuring really the homegrown nature of the ideology that
Sure.
we're dealing with, and you actually don't deal with a much more key aspect of the problem because you're just looking for the people who are paying for it all rather than the ideological nature of the problem. I want to put a sort of Ilya, I should know this, but were you born in the former Soviet Union or were you?
Yes.
Okay. So obviously some of what we're seeing now, and if you read Isabel Tabarowski, I don't know if you've read any of her writings on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, is that really you go back at the origins of left-wing anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism started in the late 1960s with Zionology in the Soviet Union and these various this sort of manufactured campaign against Zionism that then found its way into the international arena and became the roots of sort of Zionism as racism and spread from there. And so you have that aspect that's been around and then found its way within the post-colonial movement through Edward Said and the like. But you also have something that might be of a little bit more recent vintage. This is the sort of the more of a, this is not the hard left, but maybe I'll call it the DEI left. People who have bought into an oppressor narrative that's not quite as stark, not quite as aggressive as the one that we see on the far left. It's not settler colonialism, but it's sort of white supremacy and the like. It may grow out of the same ideological circumstances, but it has its own form. It's not trying to overthrow capitalism, for example, or most of it is not. And so I would argue that also conditions people into a kind of anti-Semitism. It's kind of a gateway drug to the far left, and it conditions people to think in those binary terms that easily lends itself to anti-Semitism. Do you share my analysis, or am I off base there?
So I think there's certainly some truth to it. It's not easy to weigh sort of how important one set of ideas is compared to another in terms of influencing people. I guess I would say just one thing about this, that the DEI left, if you want to call it that, and the more traditional far left, they do share, obviously there are differences between the two, but they do share a couple of notable common elements. One is the idea that the distribution of wealth is a kind of zero-sum game, right? So that if one group is doing well, that's often is usually or often is at the expense of another group, and that also can lead to hostility towards Jews, given the Jews in the U.S. and in many Western nations have above average incomes and the like. And so The second is that an assumption, you see more with the DI left, but traditional far left has it too, that if there are differences in income between groups and the like, there must be some problematic factor behind it, which sometimes there is. Obviously, one reason why blacks have lower incomes than average American society is because of the long history of oppression of blacks. But in other cases, it's not necessarily oppression or a problem. Like the fact that immigrants from India have high incomes. It's hard to argue that's because Indians have been oppressing people or discriminating against them. So if you have a sense that group differences are inherently suspect, and you combine that with a zero sum mindset of the world, then that leads to what I mentioned before, sort of a distinctive left wing version or far left type of anti-Semitism, which focuses on not on the ethnic or religious aspects of Jews, but rather on their role in the economic system, where they're disproportionately represented, say, among capitalists or merchants and the like, and also have somewhat higher incomes than the average. And so if you're generally a believer in a zero-sum view of the world and you're suspicious of market economic transactions, then you will often view with suspicion a group that is disproportionately represented in the what you might call the capitalist class and has higher incomes. And this is not a new thing. Karl Marx had this in his essay on the Jewish question back in the 1840s. In that essay, he advocated equal rights for Jews, but he also denounced Jews for being involved in capitalism and called for the end of the Jewish religion and so forth. And so, this element of this far left aspect of or this far left type of anti-Semitism has deep roots going back all the way to the origins of modern of socialism, and it exists today on the far left, but also on some of what you just called the DEI left as well.
So let's go pivot for a second back to the right. So we've just talked about like sort of the ideological nature of anti-Semitism on the left. It grows out of certain explanations for the world, simplistic explanations of the world. And the right, I mean, there are people like Yoram Hazony and others who are trying to articulate a philosophy of the right, and there's different movements on the right, intellectual movements on the right and people trying to give voice. But do you see it as ideological as what you're seeing on the left?
It depends on how you define ideology. And both on the right and on the left, many people who have these views haven't necessarily thought carefully about the ideology or the arguments or whatnot. But that doesn't mean there aren't ideological roots. On the right, I think there are also several ideological roots to anti-Semitism. One is right-wing nationalism has a long history of being associated with anti-Semitism, because if you believe in nationalism and the idea that the nation and the government should serve the interest of a particular ethnic or cultural group, usually the majority group, you are going to view with suspicion various minorities, including Jews. And often nationalists, like socialists on the left, have a zero-sum kind of view. So if they see a minority group prospering, they might think that must be at the expense of the majority, right? And of course, that's exactly what the fascists said. The Jewish merchants and capitalists are exploiting the Germans or other people or whatnot, and getting rich off of them, and so forth. And so there's the nationalistic aspect combined with a zero-sum view of the world. Obviously, in an earlier era, and you still see a little bit of this, there's a history of sort of religious prejudice against Jews as well, which was a source of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, but still persists in some right-wing integralist types of quarters, where if you think, for instance, that Christianity should be the dominant religion of the state or whatnot, and that the state should be promoting it, then you're going to view Jews and other religious minorities with suspicion. But I think today, nationalistic anti-Semitism is more significant than the religious type, though the religious type is not 100% gone.
I know you expressed more concerned about the direction of the political right today, particularly with Trump being reelected, than sort of the woke left and its influence on our politics? Are you as concerned about right-wing anti-Semitism as you are left-wing anti-Semitism?
I guess I'm about equally concerned there, um, uh, because uh, I I think it's not clear, which side has a higher proportion of anti-Semites. Maybe even the left does, depending on which questions you ask in what surveys. On the other hand, the wing of the right that has the most anti-Semitic elements, the nationalist wing, is the one that's on top on the right now, whereas sort of the extreme woke wing, while it is significant in some institutions, like academic institutions and so forth, it does not dominate the political left overall in the same way that the nationalist right does. And so, that would be my, overall thought, though it is also true that for the moment, nationalist right wingers, Jews are not their primary target. Their primary target are immigrants and, some other groups.
Yeah. So let's say this Trump administration, and I think this is a very possible scenario, wants to go after the academic left, wants to sort of drive the stake through the hegemony of left wing politics in the academy, and takes very aggressive means to do so, even illiberal means at times. Is there an argument, do you think, for people who say, yeah, look, I think the academic left is a problem. I'm sure you do too. That, okay, look, this is about politics, and that ultimately politics is more of a sledgehammer than it is a scalpel, and that politics is inherently illiberal in some general way. I mean, politics is not a liberal conversation that we're having at a podcast or at a university. It's about whose power wins out. That there could be that could end well. In other words, I think among most of my liberal friends who are concerned about both the right and the left, they'll say, "Well, that won't end well." But might it end well? Let's say the Chris Rufo becomes, Trump's leading guy on universities, and they do everything that they can to push for an end of DEI on campuses, and they push for some kind of ideological diversification. I don't know how exactly that plays out, but they push really hard. Could that actually have the long-term effect of disrupting the monopoly and actually lead somewhere good?
So it depends on exactly what they do, but as a general rule, I'm skeptical about the desirability of federal intervention in education or government control of it more generally. I do not fully trust either Chris Rufo or other people in the Trump administration. I'm skeptical that what they really want is ideological diversity as opposed to just crushing their ideological enemies. And I think in the longer run, the better approach is not to use politics as a sledgehammer, but to recognize what you just described as the inherently liberal nature of government and politics, and therefore to minimize and reduce government involvement in education.
I want to just jump in. But what if that's not going to happen? In other words, people like us, we like to write op-eds, we like to write papers, we like to try to influence people and through the liberal rules of the game. But you could argue, and this is what Chris Rufo argues, and and I struggle with this. Is that's great, that's wonderful, but meanwhile, there are no conservatives in the humanities at Harvard. Like zero. I mean, I think.
Yeah. So my answer to that is that that's a lesser problem than centralized government control of the academy would be. I point to the example of Hungary where they did that, and it has resulted in horrible consequences. So I'd rather have an academy that's disproportionately left wing, but nonetheless there are people, including myself, who are not left wing, versus one where sort of the federal government takes a sledgehammer and tries to control the ideological orientation. There are certain particular practices, that the federal government can deal with more, like racial preferences and the like, and a few other things which would not involve the government trying to control the ideology of people who are hired or what's taught in classrooms and so forth. Secondly, I think a unitary centralized control is almost always a greater danger than diversity and decentralization, particularly since the academy is not the only center of intellectual discourse. There are think tanks, research institutes, all sorts of organizations, including right-wing ones, so that it is simply not the case that Harvard or any university has like a monopoly in intellectual discourse. On the other hand, if you let the federal government try to exercise control over it, then you are more likely to end up with centrally imposed homogeneity. And even if you think that Chris Rufo would use this power only wisely and never do anything bad,
I didn't say that.
you could ask yourself, I'm not saying you think that, but say hypothetically someone thinks that, even if it's not you, you should ask yourself, the powers accumulated by Chris Rufo or whoever Trump puts in charge of this kind of stuff will be available to the next Democratic administration, and think about how they could use it. I think in the long run, what we would want is, this could be a whole other segment perhaps, but a reduced government role in education and more competition between different kinds of institutions. We could probably do a whole other podcast on how that could be done. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's better, and I think also more feasible actually, than having some kind of centralized control where like Chris Rufo or somebody else in Washington will try to dictate what percentage of conservatives.
But there's a scenario that's short of that, right? There's a scenario that would be, we're going to take a sledgehammer to this, but we're not going to dictate exactly. Now you could say, well, that's exactly what they'll end up doing. They can't help themselves, and as soon as they take the sledgehammer to the existing order, they'll try to replace it with another set of ideological dictates that we might.
So I guess a lot depends what exactly it means to take a sledgehammer. But again, I'm skeptical in the federal government taking a sledgehammer to state, local, and private institutions. I think rarely, if ever, should that be justified.
So thank you very much for all your thoughts. I really appreciate them, and I think you've given us a lot to think about. David, do you have anything to add?
Thank you for your thoughts and your writing.
Thank you for having me. Great questions.
All right. Take care, guys. Be well.